A very good afternoon, everybody. Today we have the last day of our presentations by students on the introduction to various research articles on comparative literature and translation studies. This is the fourth article on translation studies, which today we will get an introduction to. This one is written by E.V. Ramakrishnan, and it is titled as Shifting Centers and Emerging Margins, Translation and the Shaping of Modernist Poetic Discourse in Indian Poetry. It's quite a different kind of an article from what we have discussed previously in translation studies. We have seen article by Ganesh Devi and even the yesterday's article by Tejaswini Niranjana. These two articles were having the post-colonial angle in this. And in those arguments, the translators, the research translators, they try to make an argument that how we can be free from coloniality, or how we struggle with the influence of coloniality, or how we may see the negative way. In this article, there is an opposite way of looking at it. It doesn't try to make an argument that the influence of the West is bad, or it is adverse, or we should do away with the influence. So, like A.K. Ramanujan, when makes a case for Tamil poem, is not trying to make any such argument to do away with colonial influence. The same way, E.V. Ramakrishnan also rather positively tries to look at the influence of modernity in Indian poetry. So at one point, we can also compare the school of France, French School of Comparative Studies, which talks about influence or reception, how the modernity is received by the Indian poets in Indian context, and that is happening through translation. So in this article, both these threads are also meeting together. The first thread of comparative studies, various schools of comparison, specifically the French school of comparison, which speaks about influence or reception studies. How is modernity received by Indian poets in Indian poetry? That is one. And then that is happening through translation. So that is the argument of E.V. Ramakrishnan. So with this final article, both the threads which we are discussing for last 10, 12 days about comparative literature studies and translation studies, they are meeting together in this final article. So let us have an introduction by the group of students, Sanket, Krishna Baraya, and Shatakshi. They are going to make a presentation today. So let us start with it.
Good afternoon, everyone. So today, me and my co-presenter Krishna Baraya and Satakshi Sarvaya will discuss the article Shifting Centers and Emerging Margins, Translation and the Shaping of Modernist Poetic Discourse in Indian Poetry by E.V. Ramakrishnan. This is our academic details and presentation details. Table of contents. Abstract. So first we discuss the research problem of this article. So in this article address the how Indian modernist poetry should be understood beyond the Eurocentric narrative that treat as a derivatives. And the objective of the article is the examine the role of translation in shaping the modernist poetic discourse and the locate Indian modernism within the post-colonial and multilingual context. And the methodology is the study of employs historical analysis, translation theories, close reading of Bengali, Marathi, and Malayalam poets. And a key finding is the translation emerge as a cultural creative force revealing Indian modernism is a plural, dialogical, and culturally rooted rather than just a image imitative. Key points. So, the Indian poetry between the 1950 to 1970 represent a transitional phase characterized by formal experimentation and search for new expensive modes of articulate post-independent social cultural reality. So this was a time 1950 to 17. This was a time of a transitional phase of Indian poetry that experimentation and translation we can see in this post-independence era, and the translation was central to the independent Indian modernism function as a cultural negotiation rather than mere linguistic transfer or just marginalized view by Eurocentric ideas. And the Indian modernist poetry did not emerge in isolated. It develops through the sustained engagement with European modernist poets such as Baudelaire, Rilke, T.S. Eliot, and W. B. Yeats. And some of our Indian poets like Sudhindranath Datta, B.S. Madhekar, and Ayyappa Panikar. The article shows the how translation enabled from experimentation and critique of tradition. And the translation function is a key cultural practice by meditating global modernist influence and enabling uh, Indian poets to reshape regional literary forms and challenge nationalistic aesthetics. Key arguments. Translation was integral to Indian modernism, serving as a creative, critical, and performative act that shaped the trajectory of modernist poetry rather than being a marginal activity. And through the translation, poet reshaped the poetic language, introduced new vocabulary, imagery, experimental forms, or even a new style of writing, and used fragmented or post-colonial style in a poetry that challenged the traditional norms in a Bengali, Marathi, and Malayalam poetry. So these are three main language the poet tried to use in this era. The translation transform reader text relation preparation audience to engage with unconventional form, fragmented structure, and a modernist sensibility. And meditating global literary influence, translation redefined the literary aesthetic, legitimizing experimental writing and fostering a plural, cosmopolitan, and post-colonial Indian modernism. Shifting centers and emerging margin. So the traditionally modernism has been mapped through a Eurocentric center or periphery model. So Eurocentric center believe that the Indian translation poetry are marginalized, but this article, E.V. Ramakrishnan reject these ideas, and another thing is the chapter explicitly reject this framework, arguing that Indian modernist poetry developed through complex network of translation and literary exchange rather than unliteral influence from Europe. And by foregrounding regional language and translation practice, the article shows how the literary innovation emerged from the margin, thereby displaying the idea of single cultural center. And the concept of shifting a center emphasizing that modernism in India was shaped through interaction among multiple regional modernism, each occupying a dynamic rather than a subordinate position. Modernity and modernism. So modernity refers the socio-historical condition shaped by colonialism, capitalism, Western education, and post-independence political change. And this condition generate the cultural rupture, moral uncertainty, and a crisis of value in Indian society between 1950 and 1970. And modernism emerged as an aesthetic response to modernity characterized by formal experimentation, fragmentation, and irony. And the modernist poetry reject the romantic nationalist idealism, embrace ambiguity, skepticism, and self-reflective language. So earlier I mentioned that A.K. Ramanujam reject the idea of romantic nationalism ideas and his writing a post-colonial style to reject this idea, and Indian modernism reimagined regionally grounded while engaging with the global literary movements through translation. And translation function is a meditating practice that transform lived modernity into modernist literary expression. Indian versus Western modernism. Western modernism emerged from imperial metropolitan center, and Indian modernism arose within the post-colonial context. And Indian modernism resists the nationalistic ideology, and it combined a regional specificity with a global influence. So this is information about Indian and Western modernism. This is my learning outcome. So throughout this article, I'll understand the Indian modernist poetry, the time of 1950 to 1970, as a distinct post-colonial literary movement rather than a derivative extension of European modernism. And it critically analyzed the role of translation as a central creative and cultural practice that shaped the modernist poetic language, aesthetics, and readership in Indian literature. And explain how the Indian modernism emerged through multilingual and regional literary context, challenging Eurocentric central periphery models of literary history, and distinguish between modernity as a social historical condition and modernism as an aesthetic response, particularly within post-independence Indian society. And recognize the concept of shifting center, highlight the how multiple regional modernism interact dialogically rather than hierarchically. So this is from my side. Now I would like to invite Krishna Baraya for further remaining presentation.
If we see in further information, historical context, partition violence deeply influenced to that kind of so many poet. If we see in post-independence Indian consciousness, creating trauma, displacement, and fragmentation that shaped modernist theme of loss, violence, and existential uncertainty. Because if we all know from it that how so many loss of human and so many things and major violence was created in during the independence. Then if we see Nehruvian disillusionment so emerged as the promises of national buildings, rational progress, and secular idealism failed to address social inequality and cultural alienation, then promoting poets to question nationalist narratives. Then urbanization and moral crisis transformed everyday life through a rapid city growth. Then industrialization and anonymity leading to feelings of alienation, ethical breakdown, and skepticism reflected in modernist uh, poetic expression. And we can see that so many themes also emerged from that kind of event. This is three major writer from different language. First, Sudhindranath Dutt belong from Bengali and B.S. Madhekar and Ayappa Panikar. First, if we see Sudhindranath Dutt, he engaged Sudhindranath Dutt represent an early and influential phase of Bengali modernist poetry. He marked by a conscious break from romantic and nationalist poetic traditions. He, if we can see, he translate in Bengali language so many best European poets like Stephen and Paul Valery. Then he wrote a critical essay, which name is the necessity of poetry. This essay argues for the primacy of the poetic mind over alignment reason. And his poem, The Campbell Bird, it's also reflect a modernist theme of alienation, loss of traditions, and the crisis of perception in a colonized society. Then B.S. Madhekar, he's known for his Marathi translation. So B.S. Madhekar is a central figure in Marathi modernist poetry, known for radically transforming poetic language and sensibility in the post-independence period. So his exposure to European modernist thought and poetic thoughts translation. It's both thoughts we can say Madhekar was deeply influenced from that kind of thing, and he reject the idea of sentimental, devotional, and romantic poetic traditions. So he totally break down these things. Madaker's iconic poem, Mice in the Wet Barrel Died, represent the urban alienation, existential disappear, and the dehumanizing effect of modern life. His poetry also reflects the urban alienation, existential anxiety, and a moral crisis characteristic of post-colonial modernity. Then Ayappa Panikar. Ayappa Panikar was also a leading figure in Malayalam modernist. Active as a poet, also critic, translator, and editor. Translation played a crucial role in Panikar's engagement with a global modernist literature, which informed his critique of contemporary social and moral realities. So, transition from a romantic to modernist poet, influenced by his translation of T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. His poetry addressed theme of violence, ethical breakdown, and historical disillusionment, often using myth and irony. So, if we see these three translator and poet, if we see, so, so all over this translator and poet reflect the same similar themes. So, if we see role of translation, introduced a new poetic form by enabling Indian poets to engage with global modernist techniques such as the free verse, fragmentations, irony, and symbolic imagery, which transform original poetic traditions. So, disrupted dominant aesthetics by challenging romantic nationalist ideals, then lyrical sentimentality, and a moral certainty that had previously shaped Indian poetry. So, translations also describe major roles. Then mediated modernism by translating the live experience of a post-colonial crisis, alienation, and historical rupture into modernist literary expressions. So, my learning outcomes, learned how historical forces such as partitions violence, then Nehruvian disillusionment and urbanizations created the cultural crisis that shaped Indian modernist poetry. Then translation is a central creative practice that introduced a new form, then disrupted dominant aesthetics, and legitimized modernist experimentation in regional literatures. So, how poets like Sudhirendranath Dutt, then Madhekar, and Ayappa Panikar used translation to critique traditions and articulate fragmented modern consciousness. So, it's a developed a critical perspective that move beyond Eurocentric center prehapri models, then viewing Indian modernist as a plural, then dialogic, and culturally rooted. So, this is from my side. For further information, I would like to invite Satakshi.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Sarvaya Sadakshi. I dealing with the reception of the Western modernist discourse in India. So, Western modernism in India was shaped by history, especially colonial rule and the independence. Indian rights did not copy Western modernism in blindly. Colonial experience and the post-independence disappointment influenced by modernist writing, modernist idea came through the translation, criticism, and the little magazines. Translation play a key role in the spreading Western ideas. In the Kannada literature, modernism grew through translation in bilingual writing. Western modernism fixed with the local Indian realities. caste and social power structures attained, how modernism was received. Then historical framework. I use the Andrew Lefebvre idea of the translation, rewriting, or refraction. This means a translated text or a reshape by the cultural and literary system of the target language. Translation include not only a poem but also essays, criticism, anthologies, and the literary histories. This from influence how literature is the read, understood, and valued. Uh, through the translation, Western poetic models entered Indian language. At the same time, these models were changed to suit Indian literary traditions. In Indian modernism, translation work as a deliberate intervention. It helped the challenge dominant aesthetic norms and the reshape political discourse. Then translation as a cultural critique. This translation helped writer question and evaluate dominated literary norms. It was not only a linguistic transfer but a creative intervention. Through the translation, Poetic experimented with the new norms and language. Translation gave the legitimacy of the experimentation in original literature. It encouraged writer to move beyond traditional styles. Traditional act as a bridge between native and foreign tradition. This interaction helped the create a new modernist literary expressions. Then role of a little magazines. Little magazines become an important space of a modernist experimentation. They published a new experimental writing that a mainstream publisher avoided. Translation were shared the outside formal and commercial publishing system. These magazines help create a new reading of a communities for a modernist poetry. Readers and writers cannot through these small independent platforms. Editorial decision were not neutral. Choosing what to translate and published was a cultural and an ideological act. These are my learning outcomes. Learned that the reception of the Western modernism in India was the historical specific shaped by translation from colonial rule to post-independence nationhood. House social structure as a caste and power relations influence the reception and the adoption of a modernist aesthetic, particularly in the regional context like a Kannada literature. Learn that a translation function as the cultural strategy and enabling critical evaluation, create the intervention of the legitimization of the experimental poetic form, developed and understand how Indian modernism as the post-colonial plural and the regional grounded challenging prefer models through the multiple dynamic literary centers. Then conclusion. E.V. Ramakrishnan study powerful reinterpretates Indian modernist poetry by challenging Eurocentric views that treat it as the merely derivative of the Western modernism. The article demonstrates that translation was the central creative and cultural force, not only secondary and linguistic exercise. Through the historical analysis and the regional case study, it shows how Indian modernism emerged from post-colonial reliance, multilingual traditions, and the cultural crisis such as the partition, urbanization, and the disillusionment with nationalism by highlighting shifting centers and the emerging marginalized. And the study established Indian modernism as the plural and dialogic and the cultural rooted shape through the adaptation, critique, and the creative transformation rather than the imitation. So these are reference. Thank you. This is for my side.
So, Krishna, my question is, how did historical events influence Indian modernist poetry?
If we see three poet in this PPT, so if we see all mainly that poet who is present in that in presentation, so all of reflect the same theme in poetry. So because this modern poetry influence that kind of event of history, like partitions, then a failure of failure of national ideas, and urbanization. So all that kind of events are influenced to events, we can say these events influence to poet to write about this kind of loneliness theme, to and write to influence to write about the themes of poem, like loss and pain, and so this everything, loneliness, and so many themes are created from the that kind of event. So this is the answer of your questions.
Sanket, my question is, how does Ramakrishnan distinguish between modernity and modernism, and why is this distinction important for understanding Indian poetry?
Okay, so throughout, so in the articles, modernity refers as a historical and social condition shaped by the colonialism, capitalism, and Western education, or the uh, post post independence disillusionment. And while the modernism refers as a aesthetic response to the modernity and characterized by formal experimentation, fragmentation, and irony. And it is important because the Indian poetry is not just a imitation of a from Western. It is a response to the historical reality of a post independence era. So this is from my side.
Okay, fine. So we had an introduction, well-prepared slides. Some interesting infographics were also used by all the three presenters. The questions like Nistha has asked, this: what is the difference between modernity and modernism? That is quite well answered also. But again, we need to concentrate how E.V. Ramakrishnan tries to make this point a kind of distinguishable aspect when it comes from west to east, the Western influence and Indian poetry. So in what way he tries to look at this idea? Let me share a slide. Okay, so here we can see that modernity is a kind of a condition, and modernism is a response to that. That is E.V. Ramakrishnan trying to make a difference in this article. Modernity is an epochal period brought about by colonialism, marked by a capitalist economy, industrial production, and a rationalist temper. Its impact can be seen as causing a fundamental rupture in the social and cultural life of India, separating the modern period from what was pre-modern. We have discussed modern literature, that all comes into this. Now here, modernism, in this context of the article, the literary and artistic response to the disruptions caused by the colonial modernity in India, because we see from Indian angle, so we use the word colonial modernity. The stance here is a revolt. The stance is that of a rebel or a revolt against both the colonial project and the prevailing ideology of nationalism, that had become the ideology of the nascent nation state. So this we will try to concentrate on in our classroom discussion, that what was the need in India for modernity. In West, we know there are variety of reasons, uh, philosophically, culturally, socially, as well as both the world wars played a significant role in the modernity, meaninglessness, nothingness, rebel, revolt in the West, but nothing of, as such was there in India. So here we see that it is a kind of a revolt against prevailing ideology of nationalism that had become the ideology of the nascent nation state. So in the article, there are several references to Nehruvian idealism. And against that, there was a kind of a revolt that can be perceived through three poets, which are taken as a case study here. So that we will try to see in the classroom discussion. Even the other question was on historical events influence Indian modernist poetry. As such, the way we find in the West, there are no such historical influence which can affect entire country, entire India, and that can lead them to the meaninglessness or nothingness of modernity. But there was this influence through articles, through translations, and the effect was perceived in some of the writings of Indian poetry. That's what E.V. Ramakrishnan tries to look at it. So we'll continue our discussion in the classroom. We are ending this live stream here.